when I looked at the carnivore diet, and we can talk about the story of how to get into the carnivore diet or how I got interested in it, it was fascinating to me, the synchronicity of this fact that if we are eating animals nose to tail, we can really get every vitamin and mineral that humans need to thrive.
Absolutely.
It's so fascinating.
There's a couple points I want to bring up when you get a break
in
your flow, but
so that's
good.
That's the idea, that when we eat animals nose to tail, we get all the nutrients we need to thrive. And that's a fascinating kind of synchronicity with regard to human nutrition. There is calcium in the bones, and we can talk about that. When people are thinking about animal-based diets or carnivore diets, they worry about acid-base balance, but acidity in the body is a balance between protein and minerals, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And if we're eating bones, we can get lots of potassium. And a lot of people, when they think of carnivore diets, don't include a source of calcium, but we need that source of calcium for our body.
Yeah.
And then we think, where are we getting our folate? Our folate's mostly in the liver. Biotin, mostly in the liver. Riboflavin, super important B vitamin, mostly in the liver. Muscle meat's great for B6, niacin, many of the B12, for selenium, for iron, for zinc. But when we look at the animal as a whole, we see so many of the nutrients. And I've kind of talked about this before. If we eating an animal nose to tail is the ultimate human multivitamin. The vitamins and minerals in an animal are uniquely bioavailable in the right ratios. And it's such an interesting thing. And why wouldn't it be this way, right?
Yeah.
We're eating an animal. We're going to eat the whole animal. We're not going to get nutrient deficient, and we're not going to get nutrient toxic because the right ratios are there. They all kind of balance itself out. It's really a perfect food, in my opinion, when we eat the whole thing. And so when we're thinking about animal-based diets, or even including animals in our diet, if we're not eating a carnivore diet, or if we're eating what I would call a carnivore-ish diet, which we can talk about, eating animals nose to tail provides us with these really incredible sources of nutrients. And just missing organs like liver and kidney or spleen or pancreas. Liver would probably be the one most people would eat first, but missing those organs is a real disservice. And it almost honors the animal as well to eat the whole thing, to not waste it. As you and I joked about, or at least talked about before, a lot of those organs get wasted today.
Oh, hell yeah, man.
Because people don't use them, and they're so nutritious and they're much more affordable.
I tell people, go to the butcher shop, find an organic butcher shop, and ask them for any of the organs that they're not selling for your dogs and cats, because most people poison their bloody pets with crap food, and they try to feed them like human beings. And I mean, the shit people feed their dogs. The number of my own patients that have came to me and said, oh, by the way, do you think you can help me with my dog? And they're almost always feeding them some kind of canned shit with all sorts of human stuff in it. A few things came up that I wanted to bring up on the table. When you look at studies of what happens when you eat things, and I have several of them in my library that have been done, basically what you find is that the body's very, very efficient. For example, they've taken, and I know you will know these studies, but I'm sharing it for everyone's listening. They've taken, for example, if you eat the adrenal glands or the pancreas, and they've done radio markers on them, and they found that tissue ends up in exactly that organ in your body.
Isn't that wild?
So the body is very efficient. It doesn't want to rebuild a molecular structure that it doesn't have to rebuild because it fits. Kind of like if you have a puzzle piece that fits, why mess with it? So there's a lot of efficiency there. And they've studied that with many glandulars and found out every time it goes right to that region. So the point I'm making, if you're eating muscle meats and you're not getting these glands and organs, those glands and organs are living tissues too. They need to replace their cells. And there's a big difference between an eye and a brain and a kidney and a liver and a muscle or an artery or a vein. So there's a whole lot of confusion with regard to what eating really is, right? And nutrition really is. So I think we need to remember that the body's very efficient. If you want a healthy liver, eat healthy liver, right? And that brings up another issue. If you're not getting high quality organic flesh, then this kind of diet can be just as toxic, and if not worse than a plant diet, because animals are bioaccumulators. So we get to this issue of, only about 4 to 6% of the food worldwide, according to the research I've looked into, is organic. So, and nowadays you have over 100 organic certifications, 98% of them are fake.
Right.
So we've got a lot of issues of availability. And as much as you and I want to tell the truth, most people are going to have to do some work to find some resources such as, American Wild Foods and various resources that you can have stuff shipped in. And in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, I tell people, look, if you can't afford to eat a whole diet of organic, then make sure that you spend the money on organic meats, because that's the thing you got to get the cleanest, because it's a bioaccumulator. So you're going to do your very, very best to go that route. And then we have all the problem, as you know, with fish farming, and they ruin that. So one of the things that you haven't brought up that I think's worth mentioning. Cheers, by the way. Paul leaves me to my own smoke, so I'll take that. Thank you for letting me be a hog. Thank you, Great Spirit, for this beautiful smoke. Oh, is that Weston Price was one of the people I've studied, but he talked about the Indians in British Columbia, and he asked them, I believe it was scurvy, which is what, vitamin C deficiency. It's been a long time. So he said to some of the Indians there, how do you avoid scurvy? And they said, we cut the adrenal glands into sections, and we make sure that each person in the family or the tribe gets an appropriate portion, and that was able to stave off scurvy. So there must be some high level of vitamin C or something in the adrenal glands. And the other things he talked about, and others have talked about, is that when they looked at the Inuits, that when they were hunting seals and sea lions and those types of creatures, a lot of that do eat sea vegetables, they would cut the stomachs of them. And even though they're eating largely flesh, nose to tail diets, that they would eat the vegetable matter out of the stomachs of those animals. And I even think Villamar Stephenson mentioned that.
Sometimes they do. Sometimes they discard it, actually. That's a nuanced thing. So I did an interview with Nora Gagaudes, and she actually lived up in Alaska with the Inuit. And she would observe them shaking the stomachs out and kind of cleaning them out and not eating it. So I've heard mixed reports about whether they'll eat what's in the stomachs. And then the wolves up there, she lived with the wolves. And that was really fascinating. And what the wolves would do is they would eat everything and then leave the stomach for last. Like they didn't really want the stomach because it was full of all the guts of, or full of the plants.
Yeah.
And she said that one time there was a stomach that had not been eaten, and an older wolf came by that was clearly lower on the pecking order and kind of skulked up to it and ate it begrudgingly. But when the wolf ate it, it cut it open and then it shook it to shake everything out of the stomach.
Yes, but that's a carnivorous animal.
Exactly.
That's not a human being, though.
Exactly. And so who knows? I think that I've heard of people eating stuff out of the stomachs, and sometimes they do and sometimes they discard it. They'll clean it out. And so I don't know. But going back to some of your previous points, I want to highlight that when I'm thinking about things from a nutritional perspective, I accept fully that I'm only working within a framework of what I know from medical school,
yes,
which is quite limited. I know all the B vitamins and all the fat-soluble vitamins and all the minerals, but you touch on this point, which I think is perhaps even more profound, which is, what about the parts of the animal that we don't even know about? What about the nutrients in animals that we don't even know about?
Well, I think that's a big, important area of research. And I think the more we look into, we have two things to look into: the nutrition in animal and the toxicity that we're producing by farming and raising the animals. Because the problem is you eat this liver of a sick animal or the kidneys of a sick animal, and you're going to get very toxic eating that stuff.
Yes. And and the other flip side is the kidneys. What if the kidney has a nutrient that's unique to kidneys? Right?
Exactly.
And that's one of the reasons to eat nose to tail. And this gets into, it can sound like a little bit of voodoo, but I think it's a good argument to eat nose to tail. And then that thought came from another thought, which I didn't get a chance to highlight earlier, which is that there are many nutrients we know of that are found only in animal foods.
Such as?
Creatine, carnitine, choline, carnosine, taurine, on and on, B12. And these are key fundamental nutrients for humans to be healthy. These are some of the most important nutrients. Vitamin K2, the menaquinone family, only found in animal foods. There are some menaquinones, MK4, found in fermented plants, but in terms of the longer chain menaquinones, MK7, MK11, MK10, generally only found in animal foods.
Can you give us a quick review of what each of those nutrients does?
Yes. So carnitine. Let's start with creatine.
We know creatine because every bodybuilder and weightlifters poison themselves with it.
Right. But so creatine, there's about 5 grams of creatine in a pound of muscle meat.
Right.
And there's really no creatine in plant foods at all.
Yeah.
And so earlier in this podcast, I talked about how we can get all the vitamins and minerals we need to function optimally as a human. And I'm happy to go down the vitamin C rabbit hole from animals.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wanted to add to that is if we get plus many of these magical, quote, animal nutrients that are not found in plant foods. So animal foods are really incredible for humans. So creatine, it's part of the phosphocreatine system, the phosphagen system. It stores a phosphate to donate ATP during times of anaerobic respiration.
Thus for weightlifting and athletics.
Sprinting, athletics, but also for any process that requires ATP in the body, such as thinking in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And we can make some creatine as part of the methylation process. People may be familiar with methylation cycle. Much of the methylation intermediates, specifically SAMe, so S-adenosyl methionine, is made after homocysteine is converted to methionine, and then methionine becomes S-adenosyl methionine. SAMe is S-adenosyl methionine. It's a major methyl donor throughout the body. A majority of S-adenosyl methionine goes to make choline and creatine. Those are the two things by donating a methyl group, right? So we need to make creatine, but we can't make enough. We really don't make enough. What's been shown repeatedly is that vegans and vegetarians have lower levels of creatine than omnivores. And this is the kicker. If we give them back creatine, they get smarter.
That's funny.
Processing, memory recall, processing speed, they all improve radically when we give vegans and vegetarians creatine. If that is not a cut and dry argument that type of a diet is lacking a crucial nutrient, I don't know what is, right?
I have to tell you something funny because when I was a vegetarian for a year, which you and I talked about, one of my buddies, Matt Nickel, who's surely the most successful strength coach in Canada, he trains more professional athletes than anybody in Canada. He's strength coach for the Toronto Maple Leafs for a long time. And he's a good buddy of mine and a good hardcore weightlifter. And when I was a vegetarian, he gave me a T-shirt. It says, "Vegetarian, tribal member who can't hunt, can't fish, and is useless to the tribe." And so when you're talking about the lack of creatine and mental function, maybe that ties into the T-shirt. I wore it with pride because, my exploration in vegetarianism, as I shared with you, is so I could do an honest exploration and talk about it from legitimate experience instead of just being a typical academic talking head. And Jung said intellectualism is a common cover-up for fear of direct experience. And there's one thing I've never wanted to do is fall into the camp of an intellectual. And most people that have opinions for or against any diet or anything in life are intellectuals. They don't really know what they're talking about. It's just swapping one idea against another idea, but they really don't know what they're talking about. It's like someone who's telling you what surgical technique is better when they've got no training in surgery.
And as you and I talked about, I actually had a vegan phase.
Yes.
I was a raw vegan for 7 months about 15 years ago and lost a lot of weight and had my own health issues. But yeah, so I've been down that road too. So that's creatine. And basically a pound of meat a day will give us 5 grams. We will eventually saturate our stores of creatine and we'll just pee out the rest.
Or you'll get real swollen because I tested it.
If you get too much.
Yeah, because I at the time I tested creatine because I had so many athletes wanting to use it. So my approach is test everything first so you have some knowledge of it. But I kept bringing the dose of creatine up. And then I found that I was losing muscle definition. I was holding a lot of water. It was almost like my body was becoming toxic. And I noticed that I was actually starting to get a little bit mentally lethargic, which may have been my detox pathways being overloaded.
Yes, because when you take creatine, that is a it is a methylation product. It frees up more methylation reactions. It can cause some changes, but most people don't need more than 5 to 10 grams of creatine a day. Again, that's 1 to 2 pounds of muscle meat a day will give you 5 to 10 grams of creatine.
Yeah.
A lot of creatine loading protocols are 20 grams, and they're meant to be done over 5 days to saturate your muscles. But taking 20 grams of creatine a day, long term, I'm not familiar with any ergogenic performance benefits from that. But just what we know is that if we're missing it, we're subpar.
Yeah.
So if people are not eating a pound of muscle meat per day, they may not be getting enough creatine, and that could be affecting their performance negatively.
That's a fair bit of meat for a lot of sedentary people, though, don't you think?
Well, it depends on the quality of the meat, I would say, and
Yeah.
the sources, especially if we're thinking, I mean, I don't know. I don't think of that as a large amount of meat because,
Well, you live on a nose to tail diet, so you aren't eating other things.
yes,
So that a pound of meat isn't a lot. I mean, that would be a pound of food for you.
yeah. I mean, I think in terms of protein, you know, I'm an advocate for people getting enough protein, but not too much protein.
Yeah.
And I think most people on the planet would benefit from a pound of meat per day. It could be from a variety of sources. Part of that should probably be organ meat,
Yes.
but I think that's a sensible amount for most people. And for people that are larger, maybe even more. And we can talk about the ratios of protein that I'd recommend. But
Well, one thing I'll interject there is that a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that if you're talking about a pound of meat or 7 grams of meat, that equals a pound of
Exactly.
protein. But that's very dangerously wrong because 70% of most muscles is water.
exactly.
So when you actually do the math on that, a pound of meat is not a huge amount of protein.
100 grams, give or take.
Yeah, so that's an important factor because, what I used to do just to show even nutritionists, I'd give lectures all over the world, as you can imagine, with hundreds of people in the audience. And I would say, okay, how many of you have a degree in nutrition or you're a dietitian or whatever? And, 50, 60 hands would go up. So I'd say, okay, if I eat 7 grams of lamb, how many grams of protein did I get? I never had a single person tell me anything except 7 grams. And I'd be like, I got news for you.
Yeah.
You might want to get out your nutrition almanac and remember that those animals are about 70% water. So a lot of that weight and mass is just water.
It's quite confusing for people, and I try to clarify it, that a pound of meat, 454 grams of meat, is 100 grams of protein,
Yeah.
give or take, depending on the fattiness of the meat, the leanness of the meat, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that when we think about osteoporosis and sarcopenia or avoidance of sarcopenia is loss of lean muscle mass as we age, getting enough protein is key.
Yeah.
And we haven't even gone into this, and I want to talk about the other animal nutrients as well. But what we know pretty clearly is that to trigger muscle protein synthesis, we need about 2.6 grams of leucine. It's one of the branched chain amino acids. And that's not in a pound of meat. You can get 2.6 grams of leucine if you ate a whole bunch of beans, like, a lot of beans, but you can get 2.6 grams of leucine if you eat 3.5 ounces of meat. Right. And so for all of us as we age, the protein requirements go up.
Yes.
Because we want to maintain lean muscle mass. And so I did a podcast with Gabrielle Lyon. I talked about this in that podcast with her. My parents are both 69 years old. And I'm thinking, if I were going to make a recommendation to my parents or someone of the same age on how to maintain lean muscle mass, which we really know is imperative for insulin sensitivity, glucose disposal, for strength of the core, strength of the body, they are going to need to eat 3.5 ounces of meat multiple times a day to trigger muscle protein synthesis, which is essentially the mTOR pathway, the mammalian target of rapamycin pathway. It's an anabolic pathway. People get worried about overactivating this pathway, but what I would say to them is with an intermittent fasting routine or by having some sort of a time-restricted eating window, you will not over-trigger mTOR, and that one of the main triggers of mTOR is insulin. That's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down, but I think that for people to get enough protein in their diet—
and exercise.
Yes, and exercise will trigger mTOR. And so those things combined are crucial to maintain the muscle mass as we age. And so I don't think of 100 grams of protein a day as a lot for anyone. I think that in general, we would be much healthier as a population if people tried to get about that amount. And in the book, I recommend for people about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight or lean body weight. So about 0.8 to 0.9 grams per pound of body weight, or give or take, for protein per day for people. You or I weigh more than 100 pounds. I think you or I could do better with even more protein than 100 grams. But
I think that's very reasonable.